Welcome, and thank you for joining Open Lands for our 2020 annual luncheon, a virtual journey from the Amazon to Chicago.
We're Open Lands. We're awesome.
Passing it off to you, Ted.
I'm Carrie McNally, and it is an honor to serve as chair of the Open Lands Board of Directors. This celebration and the exciting conversation you're about to take part in is possible because of the generous support of our annual luncheon sponsors and supporters. Thank you. Your gift makes Open Lands' essential work possible, ensuring land protection can continue at dynamic scales across the region for all to share in and enjoy, including the birds. Now, let's celebrate those birds, flying overhead as we've been cooped up at home all these months. We're lucky. We live right under the superhighway that many birds take from North America to South America. Every fall, when I peer out of my window, there's a chance that the birds I see are heading to the Amazon. But our world's climate is changing. Development is encroaching on the Amazon. These birds face difficult challenges, increasing challenges. The great news is that solutions do exist, and we've brought to you experts who understand this issue better than most of us. Avecita Chicchón is Program Director for the Andes Amazon Initiative at the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. And John Fitzpatrick is the Executive Director of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And here's your host, Open Lands Board Member, Wendy Paulson.
The Amazon region lies thousands of miles from Chicago. For many, it's a familiar name, but an abstract concept. So Ave, how would you define the Amazon in broad terms?
Well, the Amazon is the last tropical forest undeveloped on Earth that is huge. If you think about the size of it, it is the size of the continental United States, so that's really big. And 82% of the Amazon is covered by tropical forest. And the headwaters of the Amazon start in the Andean region. So there are about 8 countries that you can locate within the Amazon region. It is full of biological diversity, lots of different fauna and flora, but it also has many indigenous peoples. Over 350 different indigenous cultures that have developed their own ways of livelihoods in the Amazon. So, pretty diverse in terms of nature, but also in terms of culture.
Okay, well, that's a great overview of a very extensive place. Fitz, would you add anything?
Oh, great description, Ave. It's, really, it's the world's heartland of biodiversity, especially as you go westward in the Amazon, up towards the headwaters, as you approach the foothills of the Andes, whether you're in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, or Bolivia, the diversity of animal and plant and microbial life just reaches the Earth's zenith. And to be out there in the midst of these places, it is genuinely paradise. And fortunately, a lot of it still is, although we hear a lot about the problems, and there are many facing the Amazon. Vast areas of this spectacular forest area are still quite intact and beautiful.
And you've both mentioned the tropical forest, but I also think of it as a wetland. Would you agree with that? I mean,
Absolutely, yes. 1/3 of the Amazon, I think, is wetlands. And actually, the relationships between water and forest are so tight that you cannot think about one without the other.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And part of the excitement of the Amazon biologically is that there are so many kinds of wetlands. You can take the Amazon itself, which is, of course, in many places is way more than a mile wide. And it goes through these seasonal inundations where it creates vast areas of flooded forest. And you go all the way up into the more upland places where they're only seasonally inundated. Yeah, an incredibly diverse wetland system.
and an extraordinary variety of fish, too, freshwater fish, found nowhere else in the world. Well, you both have spent extensive time in the Amazon. So tell us a little bit about your respective journeys. Fitz, you, I think, as I recall, are from Minnesota. So how did a Midwestern kid get to the Amazon?
Yeah, Midwestern kid, central Minnesota, grew up at the border of the prairie and the deciduous, just like Chicago is today, right now. I first saw the Amazon as a fortunate college student taken down for several weeks by my undergraduate mentor, Raymond Painter, who himself had worked in the Amazon quite a bit. But my real experience, firsthand immersion experience, was in 1974, and when I and 4 other people spent 3 months in a remote place inside the Manu National Park in southeastern Peru. I was the only non-Spanish speaking person there, so it also helped me learn Spanish. But oh my God, as a North American who'd never done this before, the process of learning what turned out to be 550 species of birds and all of their calls, it was, for a bird guy, absolute nirvana.
Well, Ave, you come to the Amazon from a different geography and a different perspective. So tell us about where you came from and how you found yourself in the Amazon.
Sure. I grew up in Lima, but my parents, my siblings, they're all from Cajamarca. So that's in the highlands of Peru in the north. I grew up going to Cajamarca sometimes, and I went to the upper Amazon, but the headwaters. But I wouldn't think that that was the Amazon. That was more highlands. Really, when I was 18, one of my cousins and I went on a cargo plane to Iquitos just to check it out. And it is interesting to think about that because that cargo plane, of course, was really cheap. And the cargo was microbuses, like vans. And coming back in the cargo plane, it was all logs, timber. It was really interesting, you know? But anyway, we arrived in Iquitos. It was wonderful. It was very different than anything I had seen. And just at the university, I studied anthropology. So my idea was to go back to the Amazon. So my immersion into the Amazon was really through the eyes of indigenous people. When I did my bachelor's thesis in anthropology, I went to the Selva Central, to the Satipo region, and lived with the Ashaninka people. I learned about the Amazon, I learned about nature through the eyes of the Ashaninka people. I learned with them how they survived. You know, growing up in Lima, I couldn't recognize one plant from the next, you know, but I learned about different plants from them. I went fishing with them and hunting at the beginning, not so much because they didn't like women to come with them. I managed to do it later on, but not at the beginning. So it was a wonderful experience. And after that, I worked with other indigenous groups. But the first time was with the Ashaninka in Peru, and then with the Tsimane indigenous people in the Beni in Bolivia. That's where I did my dissertation and where I spent a lot of time with indigenous people.
Okay, so another contextual question. Why is the Amazon important? Why should we in Chicago and elsewhere care about it?
That's such a huge question.
It's a huge question.
I'll just say one thing that comes first to mind. It is by far the world's largest contiguous tract of tropical forest. Mm-hmm. It dwarfs even the Congo, let alone the Indonesian forests, and so is a huge cradle of biological diversity, only a tiny fraction of which we actually understand right now. So it's still a huge basket full of undiscovered treasure that represents the biological diversity of life on Earth. I'll just also mention that it defines the rainfall patterns of South America. We now know that we need something around 80% of that forest to remain intact in order for the hydrological cycle of South America to remain intact. If we lose much more than that, the entire agricultural systems and rainfall systems for the people of South America will be altered. And so it's a stabilizing influence across, this amazing continent.
And one could argue that what you have described is so important not just for South America, but globally as well. Because what happens in these great tropical forests has an impact on the global climate as well. So in the Midwest, you have to recognize that your own climate, your own agriculture may be affected by what happens in South America. And there are a lot of connections as well. When we think about the production of food, Brazil is one of the main exporters of beef and leather and other agricultural products. So the U.S. consumes some of that as well. There is a great deal of connections. There are lots of products that probably people that are listening consume and don't know that come from the Amazon. Not to go very far, cacao, chocolate comes from the Amazon. A lot of other products too. Now acai comes from a palm in the Amazon.
Not to mention castaña, Brazil nuts, right?
Exactly, Brazil nuts.
The Amazon is also the wintertime home for a bunch of birds that we know in the Chicago area and the surrounding communities for a few short months from May until September. But for millions of those birds that we know so well for a few months, spend a bulk of their life actually in the Amazon, especially in the western Amazon, either actually wintering there as blackpoll warblers do and Swainson's thrushes and Canada warblers and Connecticut warblers, but also passing through there like yellow-billed cuckoos and eastern kingbirds that go all the way down to the Paraguayan and even Argentinian forests. So the Amazon is essential for a huge amount of the livelihoods of the birds that we think of as North American breeders. I remember my first fall I ever spent in southeastern Peru in the lowland Amazon, and I suddenly realized that there's a new flycatcher. I studied flycatchers, and there's a new flycatcher that's establishing a territory along the edges of the lake, and it turns out there were 4 or 5 of them up and down this Oxbow Lake. And I knew it was some kind of peewee, and then I realized, oh my God, these are eastern wood peewees. And they spent the entire fall and winter along that shoreline. They had territories and so on. That bird that we know in the Chicago forests, beautiful, spring and summertime singer, it depends on the Amazon for more than half of its life.
In fact, just last month in early September, it seemed like the woods were full of peewees, singing peewees. When most other birds have quit singing, they're still singing and they're getting ready to go. And eastern kingbirds, same way. They nest even along the Chicago lakefront. But
and
again,
those kingbirds by now, those kingbirds are flying around in big flocks.
Big flocks.
Which is totally unlike what they do in the summer around Chicago, around Illinois. But now they're in flocks and they're moving nomadically around the Amazon looking for big, tall, fruiting trees. Many of them will be down as far south as Paraguay and Argentina.
Yeah, just really awesome journeys. Ave, I'm wondering if you can give us any insight into the effects of the pandemic on the Amazon.
Well, the pandemic has hit really, really hard in the Amazon.
The ominous clouds of the Amazon rainforest. A storm is coming. The COVID-19 virus pandemic already has. The communities of the river have little resilience to the diseases of the outside world. It's been a plague here for over 300 years, and it's back worse than ever.
And at the beginning, it was not very hard, but what happened is that it has spread very quickly through the cities, and also people that were going back to their communities took the virus with them. For example, in Peru, early on in the pandemic, one of the managers of Pucacuro National Park died because of coronavirus. That was like the first person that died, and after that there were many in the protected area system. So the work that we do is support protected areas, the protected area systems. So not only people that work in the protected areas, but also indigenous peoples, most vulnerable people in the Amazon. Well, there are almost 1 million indigenous people in Brazil. And out of 1 million, about 23,000 or more are infected, and over 650 have died so far. And those that are most vulnerable are the older people, the elders. For example, Payacan, a Kayapo leader, recently died of COVID-19, and also Ignacio Duri, a shaman from the Infierno native community next to Explorer Scenes in Tambopata. He also died. That hit me really hard because Ignacio was one of the first people I met in Tambopata. And when I first arrived, I went to his community. He was so welcoming. I learned so much from him. And he was hit and he died. And what is so sad about it is that, you know, he dies, but he also takes a lot of knowledge with him. And when we talk about indigenous knowledge, we're not talking about a monolithic body of facts. Yeah. We talk about the elders that hold this knowledge in themselves, and hopefully they have transmitted that to the younger generation, but it's just a big loss to see that these older people are living.
There's been a lot of attention focused on the Amazon over the decades, over the centuries. I mean, it's been a destination for researchers, for explorers, lots of documentaries coming out of the Amazon, whether it's David Attenborough or other interpreters of nature. And I'm just wondering with how you two perceive the state of conservation in the Amazon. Can you point to some big successes? And then I'll ask you about the failures, but I'd like to hear about successes.
Yeah, that's a great question, Wendy. I think it's super important because we do hear about problems. And, you know, as we've said, there are a number of them, which we could spend a lot of time talking about. But it is important to recognize that in all of the countries of the Amazon, very large areas have been set aside through the years, through the decades, as preserves. And I can speak most confidently about Peru. Peru has been a leader really in recognizing the importance of setting aside really quite vast tracts of the Amazon and the Andean foothills. Tracts the size of whole U.S. states are protected as national parks, and additional areas around them as buffer zones where they control things like logging and tourist access. And one other thing that I think is a promising feature of conservation in many parts of the Amazon, which is that ecotourism lodges have been set up in many of the most interesting and accessible, or actually some of the least accessible places in the Amazon, that have encouraged people from all over the world to get down there, get to know these areas, you know, develop respect for them. So I think a consequence of really successful ecotourism is that some big areas, even outside of national parks, are beginning to be respected by the local communities, where they actually gain livelihood as a consequence of the fact that people from around the world want to come and enjoy those spots.
Go ahead, Ave.
No, I was just going to say that I agree totally with Fitz about the protected areas issue. Across the Amazon, nearly 50% of the Amazon is under some sort of protection. You know, there is a range of protection from national parks where you have a strict protection to sustainable managed areas. So if you count all of that, about 50%, that would be like the size of half of the continental U.S., is under some sort of protection. But as we just heard earlier, we need to protect the Amazon in a way where we have to avoid a tipping point. And the tipping point from forest to savanna will get if we deforest, if we have less than 70% of the forest. So we still have a lot of work to do. And one is to consolidate, maintain the gains of having those protected areas and indigenous lands, because I'm counting indigenous lands as conservation areas too. They are large and they are well managed. So one of the successes that I think the conservation community has had lately is the establishment of sustainable finance for networks of protected areas across the Amazon.
Yeah, and in a world where we see lots of dark spots, it's really important, I think, to acknowledge the bright spots too. But there are challenges, obviously. I'm just wondering, what do you all consider the biggest challenges to conservation in the Amazon?
Well, I think one of the significant challenges that has faced the Amazon over my lifetime, our lifetimes, and is accelerating is the unending drive to continue to build new roads and highways across this vast area to connect whole regions that had previously been connected only by water, by rivers and tributaries. Now, one by one, connecting all of these remote areas by roads. And we know the inevitable consequences of roads, which is that they lead to networks of additional smaller highways. They lead to colonizations and the continued, death by 1,000 cuts, destruction of local areas. But today, the 21st century is an era of information science, and what we've been developing at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology are programs like eBird that allow people to participate in the documenting of the biological diversity of Earth, just with your iPhone. And as Ave knows, a number of the indigenous peoples in the Amazon are actually quite proficient with mobile phones and apps. And actually, Ave, with Moore Foundation support, we've developed a program by which the peoples of the Amazon can actually document the seasonal migrations of commercially important fish. So we've actually begun to work on functionally an eBird for fish that will allow us to understand a lot more about the commercially important market-driven interest in a large number of species of fish in the Amazon. And that's a consequence of having some technology moving across the landscape. So not all development is leading to bad things. It's leading to some really good things.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Fitz, because it is so important to take into account what's happening in the Amazon with citizen science. I think that democratization of conservation and the tools that environmentalists have is so important to disseminate among so many people. I have seen some of it in the field. It is amazing to incorporate people's knowledge through an act that is of documenting something like migratory fish or even birds is fantastic. I think that's another bright spot.
I love your term, Ave, the democratization of conservation. And I think that is what eBird has done. It has revolutionized what people can do.
Every day, millions of people around the world enjoy watching birds and recording their sightings.
What if there were a way to take all of these observations, yours, ours, everyone's, and put them all in one place?
If we could do this, we would fundamentally transform not just birding, but science and conservation.
From this idea emerged eBird.
And that actually brings me to a point. For those not actively engaged in the conservation field, as you both are, do you have suggestions for what individuals can do, who care about the conservation of the planet, but aren't sure what they can do? I mean, I think eBird is a prime example.
Yeah, certainly Ave's reference to citizen science. Participate. You can be wherever you are. You have the capacity to become literally a biological sensor for what's going on with the biology of our planet. So yeah, that's a big thing. I'm just going to go ahead and say that there are a number of really good conservation-oriented groups, both large, international in scope, and small, that contributing a few dollars to makes a big difference, because these are usually lean operations for which they can do a big conversion for every dollar that you give them. So,
Ave, anything to add to that?
I think that it is important also to participate in the political process and make sure that you vote for leaders that are environmentally oriented. I think that's very important. Another thing to do, I think, is to be mindful of what you consume. Sometimes you just buy things and don't see what the ingredients there are there. I think it would be good to avoid consuming things that come from deforestation from the Amazon.
Yeah. Look for bird-friendly coffee, for example.
Perfect, yes. Bird-friendly coffee, perfect.
Both of you mentioned mentors that led you on your own journeys. I think we should never underestimate the value of sharing our love of nature with others, and especially with children.
Boy, you hit the nail on the head there. You don't need to be taking somebody to the Amazon. Yeah. You can take them on a walk along the lake shore of Lake Michigan. You can take them out into the prairies west of town. You can take them into the forests of northern Illinois. Just getting kids turned on at the earliest possible age to how fun it is to be in nature and actually watch a butterfly really closely or get some cool shorebird through a telescope. It makes an enormous difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's just a good way of just pivoting quickly to Chicago, because they seem so different, these two areas. You know, you've got the vast Amazon wilderness. You've got what was once wilderness in Chicago. You've got now millions of people. You've got millions of acres in the Amazon, millions of people in Chicago. Do you see some connections between the two regions and in the ways in which we can approach conservation?
I sure do. I see connections big time. Wendy, I think you were involved in the early establishment of this amazing consortium of organizations, both public and private, called Chicago Wilderness. I know, in fact, it was Debbie Moskowitz, this year's honoree, who first told me about the thought about using that word for this idea. And my having, as she has too, of course, spent so much time in the true wilderness of the Amazon, my first reaction was, no, come on, it's not. But honestly, wilderness takes lots of scales, right?
Yeah.
You can be in places around the Chicago area that if you allow yourself to come down to the scale of that place, you are exploring wilderness. And the great thing that's happened around Chicago, which has become a model for urban areas around the world, is you're tying a whole bunch of different people and organizations and thought processes and so on together, and the idea that we have a connected set of natural areas that intermingle themselves among our great big cities. It's just a marvelous thing. So, that to me is a great connection between the wildernesses of the two continents.
Yeah.
So, you know that I lived in Peru with my husband, my two kids, and we moved to Chicago in January. 1 January years ago. And it was so cold, so snowy that I was thinking, why did I make this decision? But what was really nice was for me to find a connection by visiting the Film Museum, visiting Debbie and her team there, visiting the Shed Aquarium, and visiting the Brookfield Zoo. So for me, the connection between the Amazon and Chicago is also those fantastic cultural institutions that exist in Chicago and that people can go, and just learning from them is a wonderful thing to do.
Chicago is it's got a huge piece of my heart, I have to say, having
and
spent
mine.
12 years there. So,
With the city kids that I work with, and we're looking at just neighborhood streets, some that are very dense with people and so forth. But it's incredible what we often find, and some things as chimney swifts flying over our head that are on their way back from the Amazon in the spring. And it's a wonderful sense of connectedness.
We love to point that out in the spring as we see the new arrivals, purple martins coming back.
Yeah.
Guess where that bird has been down in the Amazon?
You both are optimists. You're both so active in constructive conservation action. What gives you hope?
For me, the committed people that I interact with in the field, in the US, the younger people that are eager to learn and want to change the world, that gives me hope.
I agree. It's about the hope. Hope is really, we can rest our hope in two things fundamentally: the people, which Ave just mentioned, and the places. And every single new place around the world where the people who understand it and have worked on it have worked hard enough to get that place protected, that's a new ray of hope, because conservation is about permanence, about the long term, and every one of these places that it gets protected finally matters for the globe. And all we do is keep focusing on those successes, and step by step, bit by little bit.
Paso a paso.
Paso a paso.
Así es, paso a paso.
Okay, well, thank you both. I can't thank you enough for leading on this virtual journey from the Amazon to Chicago, the second part of this year's Open Lands Luncheon. And tomorrow, you'll receive a link to part 3 of the program, which will bring you squarely back into North America with a short film about how Open Lands is making the Chicago region a more beautiful, vibrant, and healthy place for nature and people.
Trails, active recreation, that's part of our mission. We look holistically at the entire region and to see what that mosaic is that provides opportunities for everyone. Of course, we care deeply about nature itself. We're the stewards of it. But it's also land that needs to be experienced and enjoyed.
It promises to bring an uplift with windows into the diversity of programs that Open Lands sponsors in our home city and region. So from Ave, Fitz, and me, Wendy, thanks for listening and for embarking on this audio journey. It is a co-production of Open Lands and Worldview Solutions. Steve Bynum and Julian Hayda run Worldview Solutions and edited this podcast. We wish you all lots of time in nature and hope that you'll actively look for ways to learn more and do more to help nature and people thrive.